Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to the National Training Agency webinar series. This is our 13th webinar and our first for 2021. Today's webinar is based on tripartite approaches to skills development. I am Balchan Rambaran, Senior Coordinator of Enterprises at the National Training Agency of Trinidad and Tobago, and I have the pleasure of moderating this afternoon's session. Our session today is aimed at sharing information and supporting stakeholders in capacity building in alignment with technical vocational education and training. Let me take a minute to remind our audience, the NTA is the leading body responsible for the coordination of all technical vocational training in Trinidad and Tobago, and the home of Trinidad and Tobago First Univoc Center. Today's topic on tripartite approaches to skill development will be presented by the Senior Skills and Employability Specialist, Dr. Paul Comyn, from the Skills and Employability branch of the International Labour Organization, that is the ILO, Geneva, Switzerland. Dr. Comyn will be discussing tripartism and the shared responsibility for skills development, the importance of social dialogue in skill systems, and tripartite approaches to national, sectorial, and enterprise levels. The session will allow Dr. Comyn to share his 30 years plus experience with us in TVET and skills development, as well as his efforts towards expanding and reforming TVET and skill systems in more than 35 countries. We hope that his presentation will ignite your passion and motivate you to pursue avenues in TVET that will contribute to national development and by extension your personal and professional growth and development. With that being said, let us welcome Dr. Comyn to present, and immediately after we'll have our question and answer sessions. So I invite you to send in your questions. Dr. Comyn, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing your presentation this afternoon. So Dr. Comyn, I hand over to you at this.
Great, thanks Mr. Rambaran, and thank you to the organisers. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon and to share some insights into the ILO's work on supporting tripartite approaches to skills development. I just confirm that the sound is coming okay. Okay, I'll take that as a yes and just carry on. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about tripartism in international labour standards and decent work, which are the core sort of foundations of the ILO's engagement when it comes to skills development. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of social dialogue in skills systems and then focus on giving some examples of tripartite approaches at the national, sectoral and enterprise levels. So firstly, when we talk about decent work and we talk about the link between skills development and employment, the economy, enterprises, employers and workers, we're really talking about the role that skills plays in shifting businesses, shifting sectors and shifting economies from a vicious downward circle to a virtuous circle. And the difference between a vicious circle and a virtuous circle is really how skills can drive innovation in the enterprise, at the enterprise level, enable businesses to adopt new technologies, to attract investment, to diversify the economy, to compete in new markets and to boost jobs growth. That's where skills connects with the world of work. When it doesn't connect with the world of work is when you have low quality education and training that traps the working poor in low skilled, low productive, low wage jobs, that excludes workers from participating in economic growth and discourages investment in new technology. So that's very much the big picture of how skills connects with economic development from our perspective. Of course, being the ILO, that means we're a tripartite organisation. We're a standard setting organisation, and there are a number of international labour standards that touch on different aspects of skills development. And because we're a tripartite organisation, that means at our heart is a partnership between employers, workers and government. So any of these labour standards that basically set policy frameworks for our work in skills development and in other key areas of employment where skills is also relevant. The process of dialogue and the end point of agreement between those tripartite representatives really reflect tripartism in action. But at some extent, it's at a very high level, and some people would say disconnected from the real lives of workers and employers trying to earn a living and keep a business running. And that's where we really need to talk about how tripartitism relates to skills development as we know it. One of the key references that we use is Recommendation 195, which is the Human Resource Development Recommendation. And that addresses this issue quite squarely because it talks about a shared responsibility between workers' organisations, employers' organisations and government. And it gives an outline of what those different responsibilities can be. But it also talks about those ways through which we can really look to try and increase the participation of employers and workers in the process of skills development and in social dialogue on skills issues. Recommendation 195 talks about sector-based approaches, and some of you might be aware of sector skills bodies, sector skills councils, sector training committees that bring employers and workers and government together at a sector level to focus on the issues that are affecting particular sectors. It talks about the importance of strengthening and promoting workplace learning, including apprenticeships and on-the-job training, because that's really, if you like, where the rubber hits the road, to use an expression, where we can imagine focused discussions about skills development. What skills, when, how, for whom, who will pay? These key issues at the heart of dialogue at the enterprise level, but also in the context of public-private partnerships. PPPs take many different shapes in skills development, including the joint management of training institutions, joint delivery of training, but also at a policy level when you talk about financing and other measures. So PPPs take many different forms in skills development, but at the heart of it is the idea of a partnership, and that's really what you'll hear me continuously repeat. Tripartism is about forming a working partnership to address skills issues that face enterprises, that face workers, and that face the community more broadly. And because we take such a broad view of how tripartism can influence the operation of skills systems, it means that when you think about skills systems and the different building blocks that they contain, you can actually see that tripartism, and social dialogue around skills development touches on each one of these key elements. It relates to financing, it relates to policy, it relates to understanding the demand for skills, it relates to skills development, actually training, assessing, and certifying skills. It relates to how transitions in the labour market happen, how skilled workers are matched with employers. And it talks about skills in the workplace, the link between skills and productivity. Each one of these building blocks, as we like to call them, which have many different elements within them, all are relevant to the issue of tripartism. And that's why we have social dialogue as a cross-cutting theme across all of those different elements of how we think a skills system operates. Because we all know that skills systems are pretty complex, because they don't just talk about initial vocational education and training, where you might be thinking about someone doing vocational education as part of their secondary education and then going into the workforce for the first time to find work. It also relates to the continuing vocational education and training of workers, but it also talks about employment services. We've got universities involved. We've got adult education centres involved. We've got public training organisations. We've got private training organisations. We've got industry bodies. We've got enterprises. We've got schools. We've got vocational training centres. We've got statistical agencies. There's a complex patchwork of stakeholders in skills systems. And employers and workers, of course, are key stakeholders in that patchwork. Because really what we're trying to do by engaging employers and workers in skills development, we're trying to improve the coordination. We're trying to improve the match between the supply and the demand for skills. We need to have an effective dialogue between the world of education and training and the world of work. And the world of work is represented by workers and employers. So it's a dialogue about skills and work, but it's also a dialogue about the preparation of people for work, what skills they need, and how can we ensure that where there is a demand for skills, there will be a supply of skills that meets that demand to as large an extent as possible. But coordination is important horizontally across different actors in a sector or between sectors, but also vertically in terms of how you involve employers at the local level, at a sector level, and also a national level. But underpinning all of this is a view that illustrates why social partners are important to an education and training system. Ultimately, they are key users. They're the main customers, if you like. There's also an argument that employers and workers understand their needs best. So from an education and training perspective, where you're on the supply side, if you want to know what the demand side requires and what the issues employers and workers are facing, you have to be in a dialogue with them. But it's more than just about dialogue as well. And we'll get into the different forms of social dialogue on skills development, because there is a wide spectrum of roles and responsibilities that employers and workers organisations can take within an education and training system. And those roles and responsibilities are negotiated, really, because they have to be based on a shared understanding between employers, between workers, and between government as well. So employers and workers need skills and innovation, and so they have to be brought into the education and training system. But often the key question is, how do you do that? How do you do that in an effective way? How do you do that in a way that maintains that engagement, because we often hear from government in particular, oh, we've tried to get employers involved. We've tried to get the unions involved. It's very difficult. They don't want to join our programs. They don't want to join hands. They don't want to give up the time. They don't want to spend the money. These are crucial issues that strike at the heart of a discussion about what exactly is the role of employers and workers' organisations when it comes to skills development. Because it's not all or nothing. There has to be a balance there between contributions and returns, both from the government side, but also from the workers and the employers side. So now we're going to look a little bit at, what are some of those benefits that we can see that can come from greater participation of social partners in the skills development systems. And there's a list here, and they start to give you a sense of the sort of things that we work on at the ILO. In the many countries around the world where we support our tripartite constituents to engage with skills development at the national, at the sector, and at the enterprise level. Ultimately, we want more effective tripartite policy dialogue. We want employers and workers' organisations involved in setting the direction for a skills system, in sitting around the table and sharing the responsibility for steering the workforce development system that an education and training system feeds into. We want to see strengthened roles for the private sector in the governance of skills development, and that's basically about decision making, in the delivery of education and training, and here we're really talking about partnerships with training organisations, and the financing. But that doesn't mean that simply employers will pay. If employers are going to invest, then they want to have control over that investment. They want to know where that investment's going and to feel like they're getting a return on that investment. So there's a balancing act that has to be done to ensure that employers and workers' organisations are inside the tent, okay, so a part of that dialogue, but are actually getting something from it. And here we can talk about how social dialogue involves, in some ways, giving up. The government has to give up some responsibility to the employers and workers as a way of getting them more engaged. It's one thing to say, well, you have to come because it's important to you. That will only bring people so far. You have to provide meaningful reasons for them to be involved. And we'll get into examples of some of those meaningful reasons. But we're talking about more targeted sectoral approaches. We're talking about better links between institutes and enterprises so that enterprises can take a more strategic view about their talent pipeline. Start thinking about what skills they need in the enterprise. Start drawing connections between their business strategy and their workforce development and recruitment strategy in that enterprise. Now, there are challenges there when you start talking about small and medium enterprises, but ultimately, it's about enhancing work-based learning and enhancing the utilisation of skills at the workplace. So there we're talking very much at the enterprise level. But we also talk at the sector level about making sure that skills target the gaps that exist within a sector. And we're also talking about that policy level as well. So, excuse me, to give some examples, we're going to look now at national level, sectoral and enterprise level examples. Now, at the national level, one of the major ways that employers and workers are engaged in skills development is through the issue of financing. And there are many countries, I think the number is over 100, where you have employers directly involved in the financing of training, typically through levy arrangements or other forms of taxation, corporate social responsibility levies, payroll levies, export levies that in some way or through different mechanisms are linked to subsequent expenditure on skills development. We have an example here from Thailand, the Skills Development Fund. And there are different mechanisms that shape the scope of contribution that employers make financially, but also how they get a return on that contribution through a grant system. The ILO recently did a review of 8 national training funds in the Southern African development community. And it's interesting because often you hear stakeholders say, well, industry training funds are very good because we can get employers to pay and participate. But what they don't often realise is that in many cases, these funds aren't or do not adequately involve employers and workers' organisations in the management of those funds and in decision-making around how that money is collected and how that money is spent. And often these funds end up sitting on very large surpluses, hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases, because the government hasn't been prepared to give up some of the responsibility and hand that over to the social partners so they can take responsibility for how those funds are spent in their sector to address their immediate needs. There are some very good examples. There are also some examples where that hasn't worked. So that gets back to my point about, it's a carrot and a stick situation, to use that analogy. So it's one thing to try and encourage employers and workers' organisations to participate in these sorts of arrangements within a skills system, but at the same time, you have to give them something in return. And when it comes to financing, that something in return is a bit of control over how that money is spent. So that's an example of national training funds. When it comes to policy level, even though you might think at that very high level, this is something that happens in very many countries. That's not necessarily the case. Here's some data from some work we did looking particularly at policy making around green skills, green jobs, and identifying green priorities and looking at the skills issues surrounding the transition to the low carbon economy. And we'll see here, you can see there's a very wide gap between those countries where there is quite a high level of engagement and those countries where there is a low level of engagement. But even within that, you see there's a difference between the level of engagement with employers and the level of engagement with workers. And often, in many cases, the level of engagement with employers' organisation is higher than the engagement with workers' organisations. There are some issues there, obviously, around the capacity of workers' organisations, the fact that often skills are not necessarily their number one priority because there are things like wages, working conditions, and even the right to collective bargaining in a country which creates a certain tension in whether or not skills it features in social dialogue. But you can see from this that we still have a long way to go, even at that national level, of making sure that we have good mechanisms for employer engagement, for engagement with workers' organisations at that policy level where decisions are made about strategy and financing. If we come down to the next level and we're talking about sectoral approaches, I think here there are some more good examples, and I'm going to focus on sector skills bodies, sector skills councils, industry knowledge centres. You can see from this slide there are many different examples, many different names, and we're seeing in our work at the moment a growing interest in sectoral approaches, introducing new sectoral mechanisms, or looking at old sectoral mechanisms and rethinking how they might operate better. And I'll come back to my point before about roles and responsibilities. From my experience, and I used to run a sector skills council in Australia a few years ago, one of the tensions surrounding the desire to have employers and workers organisations actively participate in the Sector Skills Council and really contribute and really develop the potential of that sector skills body was convincing the representatives that they actually had a responsibility and had a role and had something to do and could influence what was going on. If you ask employers to come into a room and look at curriculum, they're only going to come so many times. But if you invite them into a room and say, right, we've got $200,000 to spend on training in our sector, what are we going to do? You get a different level of engagement. If you say to employers in a sector, we want you to help us decide which training organisations can operate in your sector, you're going to get better engagement than if you just ask them in once every 6 months to give you advice on curriculum. So I'll say it again, this question of engaging employers and workers has to be based on meaningful engagement, not just tokenistic engagement, because we hear even at this sector level, oh yes, we tried to set up sector skills councils, but we ended up, we're going to shut them down because we don't get good engagement. And then I might ask the question, okay, but what's their terms of reference? What roles and responsibilities have you given them? What power, ultimately, what power have you given them over how skills, how the skills system work in their sector? And often the answer is, well, not very much. They actually don't have much to do. So there's this sort of self-defeating mechanism that kind of happens sometimes because there's an expectation of participation, but there's not a strong enough justification for that engagement. When we talk about sector bodies, and they do lots of things, you can think of, if you think of a spectrum, at one end you have some sector bodies that really just do the policy advice, and they might be a committee within a national training agency. At the other end, you've got independent companies, staff of 10 people, managing budgets of $20 million, really in control of substantial elements of a skills system as it applies to their sector. So sector bodies have a lot of potential, but it's very much based on what roles and responsibilities they have. I want to come now, try and move towards the enterprise level a little bit because, and I'm going to focus on collective bargaining. That can happen at a national level, it can happen at a sectoral level, it can also happen at an enterprise level. It just depends on the industrial arrangements take place that exist in a country. But it's really at the heart of where meaningful social dialogue around skills and the workplace takes place, because it provides a concrete link between skills and productivity. You've got plenty of examples, Germany, Argentina, Brazil, with collective bargaining at the national level, at the sector level, and at the enterprise level. And it's very much a very practical way of linking skills development to discussions about enterprise performance, about decent work, about employability, and about enterprise performance. So when we're talking about collective bargaining, and unfortunately skills development does not always feature in social dialogue at the enterprise level around skills development, because there are social dialogue at an enterprise level doesn't always touch on issues and skills, but there are some very good examples of it doing so. And we think it should feature more because it's about dealing with skills mismatches. It's about trying to articulate career paths and professional development for workers. If you want to retain your staff and you're an employer and you don't want to spend $100,000 to recruit someone rather than spending $30,000 to take an existing worker and identify what skills they need to fill a future skills gap that you're going to have when you introduce a new bit of technology or when you introduce a new workflow. It's about taking a more strategic approach to human resources management in your firm. It's about supporting reduced labour turnover, supporting innovation, and ultimately improved productivity, but also for a wages return, because that's what social dialogue is about. But also at that local level, you can start thinking about examples of partnerships between education and training providers and enterprises. And I think this is where there are lots of very good examples from around the world. What the challenge is often trying to expand that to the extent that every single education and training institution has multiple partnerships with different enterprises in different sectors, delivering different training products and different training services to meet the needs of that particular enterprise. That's the ideal, but of course that requires particular skills on the side of the education and training institution. So here's another bit of a problem. We say that we want strong partnerships between providers and enterprises, but frankly, often the institutions aren't really able to deliver those training products and services to enterprises, or they're constrained because of budgetary issues, because of financing issues, because they don't have the responsibility to change curriculum to the extent that they meet the particular needs of a particular enterprise. So again, it's an example of there being, it's a two-way street where it's not just a question of opening the doors and expecting employers and workers to automatically enter into social dialogue on skills. There has to be a product or a vehicle for them to become engaged in a meaningful way. And at the enterprise level, that meaningful engagement means that education and training providers are providing a product or a service that enterprises want and that enterprises need. It's important to get past this idea of corporate social responsibility. And there's some good examples here, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let's look at the Chongqing vocational schools in China. Multiple five-star hotels actually paying for hotel rooms as they exist in their own hotels to be built within the training institution. So you can go into the Holiday Inn training or room, hotel bedroom made up like a Holiday Inn room. Next door, there's the Sheraton bedroom. And so when they train hospitality students, the students have a real experience of working in a room that's exactly the same as a room that's going to be in a Holiday Inn. That kind of support was not driven by CSR. It wasn't the hotels saying, oh, we're doing them a favour. It was about saying, we need skilled workers. We don't want to have to train them when they get to our hotels. We want them to come a little bit prepared, so we're going to help the institutions with that preparation. So there are lots of different examples. I'm going to focus here. A good one in Bangladesh, a centre of excellence for leather. So this is kind of a sector level partnership, but one that also has brought enterprises in. It's basically focusing on apprenticeships, building a network of enterprises, working with the education and training system to develop a centre of excellence, like a training hub that services a number of enterprises, different courses, support for on-the-job supervisors, good certification. The program has grown. It's basically become a centre of excellence for that sector. It's attracted funding from development partners, multiple different enterprises involved, strong partnership at the sector level, strong partnership at the local level. These sorts of examples where you have very practical returns for employers and workers organisations. It's a tripartite management board there, but also returns for government in terms of very good employment outcomes, promotion of apprenticeship, increased industry engagement. And it's that kind of engagement that we're trying to facilitate, again, through our work at the national level, policy level, supporting, for example, the establishment of national councils, supporting the establishment of labour market observatories with tripartite representation, supporting the reform and restructuring of national training funds so that there's a more meaningful role for employers and workers organisations. And at the sectoral level, supporting the establishment of sector skills councils or sector training bodies, helping them establish their operations, developing strategic plans for their training sectors, and working with government to facilitate social dialogue to ensure there's a meaningful, agreed set of roles and responsibilities. And then also at the local level, dealing with enterprises, employer engagement in social dialogue. And here's an example of some of the resources that have been developed by the ILO. We've conducted research with employer organisations, getting their views about what their experience has been in participating in skills development systems, working with workers' organisations, asking them the same questions, coming up with some policy guidance, and providing plenty of examples of good practice engagement, good practice examples of social dialogue around skills development, and they're there for you to share, and we can follow up with the links to those publications after the webinar. So I think that's where my presentation comes to an end. I hope you found it of some interest. Thank you.
Okay, so what a splendid presentation by Dr. Comyn there. Dr. Comyn, thank you so much for that contribution today. I sense a lot of information was shared in terms of tripartite arrangements and so on. We have some questions for you, and let me pose the first question to you that would have been sent in. In your experience, is the quality of contribution of engagement made by sector groups dependent upon whether such groups are self-established and self-managed?
Thanks very much for the question. I don't think it does, but one of the measures of how much impact a sector body has, I think, is the extent to which it can show leadership in the sector. And leadership comes from securing the involvement of senior industry representatives. I'm talking about CEOs. I'm talking about presidents of industry associations. And to get that level of representation in sector skills bodies, I think you have to give those sector bodies substantial responsibilities. If you look in South Africa, for example, the sector education and training authorities that are responsible for dispersing the substantial funds for workplace training, they have a very more substantial role in their sector than a sector body that operates as a committee under the National Training Agency that is just responsible for setting skills standards and curriculum. That's not to say you can't do a good job, but it's a limited job. If you really want industry leadership in a sector, then I would argue you have to create the space for industry to take on that leadership role. But that's not to say you can't have successful sector skills bodies that don't have a control of financing. And there are plenty of examples where there have been many initiatives led by sector skills councils that have had direct impact on how training is delivered in a workplace or how skill shortages in a sector are being met, but not maybe at the level of how it's being financed. And so I hope you get that picture. There really is a symbiotic relationship between roles and responsibilities and impact in my mind. Thanks.
Okay, Dr. Comyn, thanks for that response. Another issue in developing countries like ours is really at the enterprise level, that culture of training within the enterprise level. You find that where a lot of organizations have not built that culture of training. And in your experience over those 30, 35 years you have, can you share with us some of your experience from other countries, how they would have dealt with this type of change of culture of training within the industry?
Yes, I think it is a challenge that every country at whatever stage of development is at, whether it's low, middle or high income, it's an issue that all countries grapple with. SMEs, because of their size, particularly those in the informal economy, don't have the resources, don't have the manpower, simply don't have the bandwidth, or they don't have the management skills to really take a more engaged approach to skills development. And a sector skills body isn't necessarily going to address that. And I think this is where we need to focus on what you might call intermediaries. Who are the people that are going to go up and knock on the door of that small business and start a discussion about skills development and what they're doing about skills and how an investment in skills might help their business grow? And in different countries, you have different people knocking on the door. In some countries, that's an industry association. In another country, it's a training organisation. In another country, it's a consultancy firm that might have access to government money to help that small business start to think about skills and invest in skills in a different way. So there's no silver bullet for this, but it does mean if you're in government and you manage education and training institutions, you really have to think about what outreach they are doing. How can apprenticeships be used as a way to enable small businesses to grow? What incentives are in place to get small businesses to participate in the skills system? And those incentives can be financial, but they can also be non-financial. Can we provide training to workplace supervisors in a small business so they start thinking about how they deliver training? Can we get our business associations to help small businesses develop a business plan that clearly spells out what skills and what investments in training are required? And can we connect that to what services and the support training organisations might provide? So I think to target SMEs, we really need local solutions where there are local partnerships between industry associations, local development associations, chambers of commerce, training organisations, enterprises, councils. We call that a local skills ecosystem. And so we need to bring people together into meaningful partnerships to target SMEs, to target local skills issues, to get that level of engagement. Sitting at in a national skills body and talking about the importance of engaging with skills development is, of course, the first step. But to make it happen, we've got to change practices at the local level. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that response as well. There's another question. Recognizing the sometimes restricted focus of employer organizations, what strategies have been employed to get them to join the skills development dialogue?
Well, look, I think it's a mixed picture out there, because you do have many leaders in industry publicly talking about the importance of skills development and the need to promote the idea of lifelong learning, the need to make it easier for workers and new entrants into a sector to engage in learning, to have access to learning, because the responsibility doesn't rest completely with employers. It rests with employers, workers as learners, workers' organisations, and government. Remember that first slide, shared responsibility. But for those employers and industry organisations where skills development is not a priority, I think a key issue is being able to demonstrate in very clear terms and in business terms what the return on investment in skills development can be. In other words, if I'm an employer and I'm going to spend money on training, what return am I going to get on that? Because often when you present a business case as to why employers should invest in skills development, because it will save their recruitment costs, it will enable them to increase productivity, it will reduce wastage, it will allow workers to take on extra responsibilities, it will allow them to change work processes. If you can demonstrate what the return, the financial return on that is, then it's a much stronger argument to get employers to look beyond the nice idea of investing in training to one that they can actually see the benefit of it. But that requires data, that requires research. And often we don't have that information. We can talk about the story, we can talk about the link, but we don't necessarily have the proof that that's the case. And sometimes it's not always clear, because there are so many factors involved in productivity. Skills is only one factor. Technology is another factor. And so productivity is not the only argument. I think we have to talk about the role that human resources functions have in industry and the need to bring together the human resources function with the marketing function, with the business strategy function. So there's a clearer, more strategic picture about where the business is going and how skills and HR can support the business to get there. So it's about really connecting skills with the issues that employers think about. Corporate social responsibility is one entry point, but it should not be the only entry point. We should be focused more on making the business case for investments in skills, because if you can make a business case, then you get real employer engagement, I think. Thank you.
Dr. Comyn, we thank you for those responses there. Again, you spoke about data a while ago and the whole idea of collection of data. And in developing countries, again, there's always a challenge to collect data at the enterprise level or even at the sectoral level. What advice you have for us in terms of how do we move past that, where we can easily retrieve or collect data from the sectoral level as well as the enterprise level?
Well, at the end of the day, you have to have a strategic understanding about what's going on in your labour market information system, in how you're collecting data. So understanding what data is available is an important first step, because it allows you to understand what the gaps are. But ultimately, I think you have to use different methods. Some of your data will come from existing collections like a labour force survey, and there are techniques that you can use to use that data to think about trends and to understand where the labour market is going. But you have to supplement that information with sector level strategic intelligence from employers about trends, about factors that are going to change the way business is done. And that has to be supplemented again by enterprise level data. But somewhere along the line, enterprise level data, sector level data, regional level data, and national level data have to be brought together and analysed so you can develop a picture about not only what's going on in that region, but what's going on across the different sectors and at the national level. And so then you have to start thinking about whose job it is to actually do that work. Sector skills councils can only go so far because they're talking about what's happening in their sector. And of course, they're going to say, our sector has more trouble than anyone else's sector. Our sector needs more assistance than anyone else's sector. So you have to get above that sector level politics and have some independent analysis that draws on data from different sources. And just like any good research exercise, you have to triangulate your data. So you need multiple sources. You need to hear different voices, but you need someone ultimately to pull all that together and to make sense of it. And even then, you have to hope that once you have a story to tell, that information is actually going to be taken up and used to inform planning and the allocation of resources across the system, because that's making the connection between skills labour market intelligence and actually planning and using that intelligence. So there's actually quite a bit to do in that, but key points, multiple sources of data, triangulation of data, and engagement with employers and workers' organisations at different levels of the system. Thanks.
Okay, Dr. Comyn, thank you again for that. Another question, and I want to believe this might be our final question. Locally, cuts in national budgets often results in cuts in training investments. What key arguments can be made to reverse this?
There's a lot of discussions going on at the moment, and actually today I listened to the webinar from Davos where our DG was on a panel, and this issue came up in the context of the recovery post-COVID and the dire situation that we find ourselves in. And it was very much an argument about making investment now in skills development so that enterprises and sectors and individuals are in a better position to support the recovery and to engage the recovery, which is going to be slow over the next 18 months. So there's a real kind of timing issue about now and the arguments that you make now about invest now and reap the returns later. But I think you have to have a very clear picture about who you're talking to. If you're talking to enterprise leaders, this is about marketing basically. What messages are you sending to enterprises? It's about innovation. It's about productivity. It's about linking business strategy with skills. And it's about trying to encourage an investment culture. At a sector level, perhaps you're talking about taking advantage of market opportunities, addressing skill shortages and skill gaps at a sector level. And at a national level, it's about investing for the future of economic development. But you also have to target individuals to try and get them to recognise that learning is important for their survival in the labour market, for their future in the labour market. So I think we need better social marketing that has different messages, targeting different actors in the skills ecosystem, but it is very much about investments and also in terms of the return on those investments at the enterprise level, but also at the national level. Very similar to the argument about early childhood education. If you can deal with foundational skills issues and behavioural issues at the beginning of a child's life, you have the potential of saving money because you don't have to spend on social security, on unemployment benefits. So again, this is about having the right argument for the right audience who you want to invest in skills. In that case, government and ministries of finance who are allocating resources across different portfolios. That's very much about the social return as opposed to the enterprise level return, as opposed to the sector level return. So I hope that answered the question. Thanks.
Yes, I think it did, Dr. Comyn. That would have been our final question. And again, Dr. Comyn, we want to thank you for an exceptional presentation this afternoon. I think you have shared quite a bit of information with us that we could look at and people could build on. So ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our 13th webinar session. From all of us at the NTA, we want to say thank you to Dr. Comyn for your time and support. Before we conclude, we wish to thank you for your continued support of the webinar series. Please be reminded that you can view our presentation and our previous webinars on the NTA's YouTube channel. We would like to say at this time, Dr. Comyn, stay safe and God bless. That brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.